Learners, we're back at you with the next video in our sequence for how to write effective themes. Now on the screen right now we've got the old school outline, the one we've been practicing since the beginning of your freshman year. Straightforward introduction, example 1, example 2, example 3, and a conclusion, all of which are in support of your thesis. The bare, basic, simple outline that it is. Everything comes in a unified form to support your thesis. Now compare that with what we're trying to do now, our persuasive format. Still got the introduction and the conclusion. You have your first argument, your second argument, and then most important, you include an opposition argument, which you will then counter. You anticipate what people who disagree with you will say, and then show why those people are wrong before they even have a chance to try to clown on you or make a YouTube video about you. So we'll get more in depth about how to do that, but that's going to be the key. That's the most important thing you can take away from this whole lesson. How to do an effective opposition or counter argument. If you can do that, then you're going to be set for anything that your teachers ask you to do in terms of persuasive essays, and most importantly, you're going to be set for the ACT, which is a persuasive essay. All right, so let's get to the nitty-gritty. All right, so your basic outline, pretty straightforward. Introduction, first argument, 2 points, illustrations, and evidence. Points, illustrations, and evidence. I don't know why I put evidence instead of illustration when I was making this outline. I must have had a brain cramp. It happens to the best of us. Bonus points, if anybody can tell me what that picture is from. And if you do watch it, you might want to get your parents' permissions first because it does contain quite a lot of colorful language. What that has to do with persuasive writing. I think it'll be pretty obvious if you can figure it out. All right, same thing with your second argument. Point, illustration, explanation, point, illustration, explanation, and then a clincher, quite simply, because of point 1 and point 2, my topic is true. Nothing has changed in the first 2 paragraphs from what we've been learning since the very beginning. However, final body paragraph, that third body paragraph, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. The opposition argument or the counter argument. So you're going to start off with an opposition topic sentence. What people who disagree with your thesis might argue. All right. You make a point that is a legitimate perspective of someone who would disagree with you. Now, it's important here that you not straw man your opponent. To straw man somebody means that you set up a fake argument that's easy to counter in order to make them look stupid. That's a logical fallacy. You see that all the time in YouTube videos where people are trying to debunk other people's videos. If you ever go down any of those rabbit holes, you'll find a lot of straw manning where they oversimplify what their opponents have to say, or they quote them out of context, and that's incredibly ineffective, because if you have to do that, it proves that your argument is actually weaker. You lose by trying to manipulate yourself into a winning position, and that probably seems pretty reasonable given our topic of Macbeth for my sophomores this year. But anyway, you set up a legitimate point for your opposition. You present solid evidence in support of that point, and then in your explanation, you talk about how a reasonable person could infer from that evidence your opponent's position. So what you're doing in those 3 sentences there for that point, that illustration, and that explanation is you are presenting a legitimate criticism or legitimate counter argument to what you believe. And it has to be legit. You don't just come up with something that's going to be easy to debunk because it's easy, because readers can spot that and then they'll realize, oh, this person can't actually deal with real problems with their arguments. They're essentially a coward and a weakling, and I don't have to believe what they say. If you want to avoid being labeled as a coward and a weakling, you have to present strong and explore strong alternative viewpoints to your own. All right, don't just straw man people. But if you're right, you can counter those strong and legitimate arguments, because your next point, rather than being a continuation of what your opponents believe, is going to be a statement that shows that despite this evidence and despite this point and despite this explanation, I'm still right, they're still wrong. Here's my evidence as to why. Here's my explanation of that evidence. And then for your clincher, you're going to go back and focus on your refutation, your point B, for why they are wrong, to prove that you know what you're talking about. After that, you go on your conclusion. We'll put up a video about troubleshooting conclusions next week, because I don't want to throw too much out at you. And then we'll be done with persuasive writing. All right, let's look at a specific instance of how these paragraphs for the body break down. We'll look at first just like one of the typical paragraphs that you'll find for body paragraph 2 or body paragraph 1, the arguments that are just in support of your thesis, the ones where there's nothing fancy. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at a counter argument or an opposition argument. And we'll try to do this in the context of some of those prompts that I put out in the previous PowerPoint dealing with the topics for Romeo and Juliet. All right. Okay, so if we're entertaining the question, who is ultimately responsible for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet, I'm going to crank out a real quick outline for all of my body paragraphs if I can. All right, if I can't do this, then it's time to email Mr. Ganley and ask for some help. All right, so if I'm confronted with this question, who's ultimately responsible for Romeo and Juliet, the first thing I'm going to need to do is create a thesis sentence. And my thesis sentence is just quite simply going to be telling my audience who is really responsible for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. Now here I've chosen Friar Lawrence. There are a ton of different people you can blame for Romeo and Juliet's death. You can blame Tybalt. You can blame their parents. You can blame Romeo and Juliet. You can blame fate. You can blame Balthazar. You can blame Friar John. You can blame the prince. You can blame Mercutio. You can blame the nurse. You can blame any number of characters throughout this whole play. Pretty much every character in it has a hand in their ultimate demise. But I think the one that you have the strongest evidence, and certainly the character that I dislike the most, gotta be Friar Lawrence. So I'm going to pin the deaths on him, and I have to present first 2 body paragraphs about why this is all Friar Lawrence's fault. So my first body paragraph will center around the idea that he married them even though he believed that Romeo did not love Juliet. All this other stuff never happens if Friar Lawrence doesn't do that. If he says, sorry, Romeo, I know you love Juliet, or sorry, Romeo, you don't love Juliet, but whatever it is, you got to talk to her dad. You got to go through the proper channels for this love, because if you're too much of a child to like deal with someone's parents, then you're too much of a child to get married. You're too much of a child to be having sex. And Friar Lawrence doesn't do that. And so that's a big reason why he's responsible for their deaths. For my third body paragraph, I'm going to focus on how Friar Lawrence aided and abetted Juliet in committing or in faking her own death. All right? It was his plan to have Juliet fake her death. It was his plan to keep his hands clean after he did the bad deed of marrying Romeo and Juliet. Once again, he wouldn't have had to do that. He wouldn't have had to help Juliet fake her death if he didn't get them married in the first place. Furthermore, he doesn't have to help Juliet fake her death. Juliet is a scared little kid, and he can help her through this situation with any means that doesn't involve faking your own death. I'm going to be honest with you guys. You're young. I'm 40, almost 2 now. If you have to fake your own death in order to get out of your circumstances, you're not seeing all the possible ways out of your circumstances. And maybe, once again, I'm not going to ask you to email me because it's probably above my pay grade. But if you're that desperate and you think like, well, my only choice is to fake my own death, all right, go ahead and email Mr. Ganley, and we'll see if we can't workshop a better option than convincing everyone who loves you that you're dead, because that's just a horrible thing to do. All right, so that breaks out the first two body paragraphs that are going to be in support of my thesis. Nothing shocking, nothing crazy in our formatting there. You have your points, you have your quotes as your illustrations, you explain those quotes, everything is gravy. Now, in the third and final body paragraph, this is our opposition argument. This is where we have to go about presenting some counter ideas to our own thesis and then refuting those ideas, showing why people who disagree with us in a very specific way are wrong. All right. So for my topic, some people believe that the ultimate responsibility lies with Romeo and Juliet. And the point for this is pretty straightforward. Suicide, by definition, is self-killing. So as such, the responsibility for a suicide is on the person who commits suicide. It's really that simple. So I'm going to have to do some work to try to show why, yeah, okay, Romeo drank the poison, Juliet stuck the knife in her chest, but they're not really the ones who are at fault for their own deaths. So I have to come up with an explanation that shows that they were put in this circumstance where, as traumatized and vulnerable young people, they truly believed this was their best option, even though it wasn't. And the way I got to do that is I got to focus once again on Friar Lawrence and the way Friar Lawrence failed Romeo and Juliet. He failed to deliver the letter to Romeo. It was an important letter, and instead of taking that himself, he hands it off to Friar John, who gets locked in a plague house and fails to deliver the letter. Because of that failure, Romeo comes to Verona, breaks into the Capulet tomb, murders Paris, and then kills himself. And all of that could have been avoided if just Friar Lawrence delivers the stupid freaking letter. Additionally, even if he couldn't have stopped Romeo from doing the stupid thing that Romeo did in committing suicide, he had the chance to save Juliet. He was talking to the living Juliet inside of the tomb before she took that knife and stuck it in her heart. But what does he do in that situation? He hears the cops coming and he runs away in order to save himself. If he goes down into that tomb, if nothing else, he can physically overpower Juliet and take that knife away from her if he has to. But instead, the coward runs. And because he runs away, because he fails both Romeo and Juliet, when they need him most, he's the one you have to blame for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. And that's ultimately what I have to come back to in my conclusion. I just have to restate my thesis sentence as my first sentence of my conclusion, and then I'm really done. So banging out those 5-7 sentences there, making sure that I had my point and my counterpoint for my third body paragraph, because I knew the reading took me maybe 10 minutes. All right, there's no quotes in here, but I can crank out, assuming I know what I'm talking about, a really effective outline that has everything I really need in it in about 10 minutes. Now, you're going to get more specific with that as you do your outlines, because you'll find specific quotes, and let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Here we go. All right, sophomores, don't worry, I didn't forget about you. If we go through, we can lay out the exact same style of overarching outline that has all of the important information that we need for Macbeth. All right, so if I'm dealing with the question that has to do with what is the primary emotion that motivates Macbeth's actions, my thesis is going to be fear is the emotion that motivates all of Macbeth's actions. All right, if you go back and you think about it, how many times does Macbeth talk about, especially in those final 3 acts, how he's not scared? Right? If you got to keep telling people you're not scared, what does that really mean? You are scared. Right? If I have to stand up in front of a classroom full of students and yell, I'm the one in charge, that means I'm not really in control. All right? And Macbeth, even though he thinks, I think, that he's being brave, fact of the matter is he's a coward. And you can look at all of the horrible things that he does throughout this play as things that are driven by the fact that he is scared. Fear makes people do horrible things. All right, so if that's my thesis, let's break down 2 support paragraphs that are going to back up that thesis. So number 1, Macbeth murders Duncan because he's scared. Right? Macbeth kills Duncan out of fear. Not ambition, not rage. This isn't Macbeth the hero on the battlefield chopping people in half. This is Macbeth, the murderer in the dark, who's scared. For my next point, Macbeth murders the families, the children, and friends of his out of fear. I just messed up that sentence some fear. So let me try that again. Macbeth murders families and children and friends out of fear. There we go. So he kills whole families when he kills Macduff's families. He kills children when he kills Macduff's child. He tries to kill Fleance, Banquo's kid. He murders his best friend, Banquo, out of fear. Right? Not out of, once again, the fact that he is a brave and great and noble warrior. And the fact is, when it comes to the murder of Macduff's family and Banquo, he doesn't even get his hands dirty. He sends hitmen to do the job for him. Once again, that's not what someone who's brave does. No one ever thinks, wow, that guy was so brave to hire those professional killers. That's generally not how we look at those sorts of things. And then, for the final body paragraph, I need to lay out my counter argument and rebuttal to that. So, some people believe that Macbeth shows great courage at the end of the play. And the point I have to back that up is Macbeth essentially goes out and fights an entire army by himself. And we've seen when we read the Iliad, Hector do that, Achilles do that. That's what brave heroes do. And for a while, even though it's a whole army versus Macbeth, he's winning. Nobody can stop him. Isn't that someone who's brave? Isn't that someone who's a great hero? The counterpoint to that you can pull directly from the text, though. Macbeth fights only because he's trapped. He compares himself to a bear that's in a bear baiting pit, and it has no choice but to fight until it's dead. And you can even drill down more specifically into his fight with Macduff, where the only reason he fights with Macduff after Macduff tells him that he was not born of a woman, Macbeth tries to walk away. But then Macduff says, all right, surrender, and we'll put you on a painted pole and let everyone look and see, here's the tyrant that was Macbeth. Because Macbeth is scared of having to face the humiliation of kneeling before Malcolm, of the rabble, the common people that he's abused for the last 3 acts of this play, coming back on him. Because he's scared of that, he goes back and fights Macduff to the death. So that brings us to our conclusion. Macbeth is driven by fear. And all the horrible things that he does because he's scared. So there you have it. For my freshmen and my sophomores, overarching outlines that'll cover most of the important stuff that you need to look at. Now let's drill down and cover a support paragraph and then a counter-argument paragraph to make sure you guys are solid on those. All right. So support body paragraph example. This is for the body paragraphs. You're going to have 2 of these back to back that back up your thesis. All right. So remember, my thesis is fear is the thing that motivates Macbeth. So for my topic, Macbeth murders Duncan because he's scared. And now I need to drill into that. What was Macbeth scared of that caused him to murder Duncan? Well, he was scared of his wife. He was scared that she wouldn't love him anymore if he didn't murder Duncan. And you need only look at what Lady Macbeth says to him when he tells her, no, we can go no further in this action. We are not going to murder Duncan. The first thing she says to him in Act 1, Scene 7, was the hope drunk wherein ye dressed yourself? Hath it slept since? And wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? From this time, such I account thy love. So when Macbeth says, we're not murdering Duncan, Lady Macbeth comes at him saying, like, what, did you have your beer goggles on when you decided before that we were going to do this? Have you sobered up and now you woke up and looked at what you slept with and you're like, oh, that was a horrible mistake? If you feel that way about your plan to murder Duncan, then I can only assume that you feel the same way about me. You must have been drunk when you told me you loved me. And as such, now that you're awake and sober, I can only assume you no longer love me either. Now, logically, that makes no sense whatsoever. But abuse doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be effective. And she knows how to push Macbeth's buttons. He truly loves her. And if he wants her to believe that he loves her, he has to do what she wants him to do. It's a trap that she's created for him. But Macbeth falls into that trap because he's scared of what will happen if he doesn't. He's scared Lady Macbeth will take her affection away from him. And that's, in real life, a lot of times, how abusers work. They don't have to hit somebody. They can just withdraw their affection. But anyway. So, what's another point we can talk about? How Macbeth shows that he's a scaredy cat. Well, the only reason he decides to kill Duncan in the first place is because Duncan names Malcolm, his son, as his successor. Now, remember we talked about this in class. In Scotland, it wasn't normal for the king's son to just get the crown when the king died. That's not how it worked. What worked was the strongest of the thanes, of the soldiers who provided the troops that made up the king's armies, that gave the king his power, they would fight to see who was the best, and the last thane standing would take the crown. Macbeth has already shown off just how powerful he is in battle. So when the witches tell him he's going to become king, he naturally assumes, all right, Duncan's going to grow up and grow old and die someday. And when he does, we'll do the normal battle royale to find out who's going to be king. And because I'm frickin' Macbeth, I'll win. That's not outside the realm of possibility. But Duncan throws a wrench in that when he stands up in front of everybody and says Malcolm will be the one who gets the crown next. When he uses his power of king to establish a hereditary monarchy where it's passed from father to son, then Macbeth's like, oh no, I've got a problem. I can't just sit back and wait. I'm going to have to do something to take what I want. And so, for our illustration, in Act 1, Scene 4, Macbeth responds to Malcolm being named the future king in an aside, saying, the Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down or else o'erleap, for in my way it lies. So if Macbeth doesn't do something about Duncan and Malcolm pretty quick, he's not going to get his chance to be king. So, because Macbeth fears his wife withdrawing her affection, and Malcolm preventing his ascension to the crown, these fears conspire to make him a murderer. There's my clincher. Point 1 plus point 2 means my topic must be true. All right, fear is the thing that drives Macbeth. All right, freshmen, I know we haven't read Macbeth. You got plenty of spoilers in that. Didn't have to make a whole heck of a lot of sense because, check it out. Here's a counter-argument paragraph talking about Romeo and Juliet. All right. Now remember, counter-argument, you're going to begin with an argument that runs against what you actually believe in your thesis, and then you're going to show why that counter-argument is wrong. So for my topic sentence, and you can begin every single third paragraph the exact same way, some people believe that. And then whatever the counter of your thesis is, whatever the opposite of your thesis is, there you have your topic sentence. All right. Some people believe that Romeo and Juliet are the two who are ultimately responsible for their deaths. All right. Now remember, my thesis was Friar Lawrence is the one who's responsible for Romeo and Juliet's death. Okay. How can I prove that that's correct? Because a lot of people out there are going to be like, wait a minute. Romeo and Juliet killed themselves. That's their fault. How can I counter that? Well, the first thing I have to do is allow that believing Romeo and Juliet are responsible is valid. All right? So my point is, suicide is literally the act of self-extermination, and both Romeo and Juliet take their own lives. That is indisputable. All right? I can illustrate that with quotes from the play. Now, unfortunately, because I'm talking about two separate suicides with a bunch of lines in between, I got to use two quotes for my illustration here. It's not normally the way we do it, but at least you guys can see if you want to write a more sophisticated, more complicated response, you can do more sophisticated and complicated things. You can have multiple quotes in your illustration. Check it out. In the final act of the play, Romeo says, "Arms, take your last embrace, and lips, oh, you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death." He says that as he drinks his poison. Additionally, Juliet says, "Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath, there rust, and let me die." She says this as she's jabbing the knife into her chest. So, yeah. It could be said that Romeo and Juliet are the ones responsible for their deaths. However, you can't leave it at that. Otherwise, your previous paragraphs have all been a spectacular waste of time. So what do we got to do? We got to come back to why this is still Friar Lawrence's fault. All right. So ultimately, this interpretation is incorrect because Friar Lawrence failed each of the lovers before their untimely deaths. So for my illustration, I'm just paraphrasing here because after the length of the double quoted illustration before, I'm not trying to make this an hour-long video. Keep it simple, paraphrase it. We still include our citation. We've got the line numbers in there. Friar Lawrence failed to make sure that Romeo received word of Juliet's fake death, and that's in 5-2, lines 18 through 22. And he's the one who abandoned Juliet in the Capulet tomb before she took her own life. That's in 5-3, lines 164 to 165. So here the audience sees, and then I'm going to go back and explain. Friar Lawrence is the one who didn't get Romeo the information that Juliet wasn't really dead, and that's why Romeo dies. Friar Lawrence leaves Juliet alone in a tomb surrounded by the dead body of her cousin, the dead body of her husband and lover, and the dead body of the man who wanted to marry her. It's a bad situation to leave a girl who's somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14. I don't think as a 14-year-old even I would have handled that particular situation terribly well. Perhaps the adult in the situation should have done a little bit better than running away. Okay, so let's tie it together with our clincher, which remember has to focus on the counterpoint because you don't want to end up talking yourselves in circles. So for the clincher, you're just going to say, although Friar Lawrence does not physically murder either Romeo or Juliet, he is still responsible for their deaths because how he fails each of them. All right, guys. So that takes us through our body paragraphs. If you're still having issues, don't hesitate to email me or post something in Teams. That way everybody can see your post. Whatever you want to do, I still have the office hours link in the announcements. Find a way to get in contact with me if there's something here that doesn't make sense, because this is kind of important. It's really the most important thing I can teach you before your junior year. So we'll go ahead and put a stop on it there. I hope you all are still healthy and well. Don't hesitate to jump in on my office hours or shoot me an email, even if it's just to say, hey, I miss you guys. I would love to hear from you. And I hope you're all good out there. Take care. I hope I get to see you soon.